Frau Drechsler had told them dawn meant death. So when the boots came down the corridor at 3 in the morning, Käthe Lindner did not move. She only listened, counting the steps, trying to decide which woman they would take first. The barracks held 47 women. The wood floor was warped from old rain. Outside, somewhere beyond the fence, an engine started and stopped. Started and stopped. Käthe pressed her cheek to the floor and felt the cold of it through her hair, and she counted the boots. 2 pairs, walking slowly, not in a hurry, which was somehow worse. 3 meters away, Elsbeth Reuter was crying without sound. She was 19. Käthe could hear the small, wet catches of breath the girl was trying to hide. To Käthe's right, Margit Bauer, the Red Cross nurse from Aachen, 35, the only woman in the barracks who had not slept since they arrived, sat upright against the wall with her hands folded in her lap, as though she were waiting for a train. Frau Drechsler slept. She slept the way commanders sleep on the night before a battle, flat on her back, breathing slow, mouth slightly open. 3 nights ago she had told them, standing in the middle of the barracks with her chin lifted, voice flat as a verdict. They will say it is a transfer. They will say it is a medical examination. Do not believe them. The Americans take the women at dawn. The men they keep alive. The women they do not. And then she had said the part that had silenced even the older women. I have seen the lists. Käthe had believed her. They had all believed her. She closed her eyes and tried to memorize her mother's face, then her father's, then the kitchen window in Stuttgart that looked out onto a sycamore tree she would never see again. The tree had a piece of green twine tied to one branch from a kite she had flown when she was 11. The twine was probably still there. She tried to fix the image. She found that she could not. Her mother's face came easily, but the tree kept blurring at the edges, and she could not tell if the blurring was memory or fear. The boot stopped outside the door. Someone in the barracks gasped. A bolt slid back. The door opened. A young soldier stood in the doorway with a clipboard. He was perhaps 23, narrow shoulders, a face that had not yet hardened into the face of a soldier. He looked at the women on the floor. The women on the floor looked at him. He cleared his throat and said, in clumsy, careful German, Aufstehen, bitte. Gehen wir. Get up, please. We are going. Käthe stood. Her legs did not feel like her own. Beside her, Elsbeth was shaking so hard that Margit had to put both hands on the girl's shoulders just to keep her upright. Frau Drechsler stood last, slow and dignified, smoothing her gray dress as though she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. The soldier with the clipboard read names from a list. Käthe's was the 4th. She walked toward the door without thinking, and there it was, the thing she wanted to remember and had not been able to fix in her mind. The kitchen window in Stuttgart, the sycamore, the green twine. It came back to her perfectly the moment she stopped trying. She almost laughed. It seemed terribly important not to laugh in front of an American soldier, and so she bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. Her name was Käthe Lindner. She was 22 years old, a Wehrmacht Helferin from Stuttgart, a girl who had spent 18 months operating a radio in a town she could no longer find on a map. She does not know it yet, but in 14 minutes, every single thing she believes about why she is in this corridor will collapse, and what replaces it will be harder to live with than dying. Before we go further with her into that corridor, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. I want to know who is in this barracks tonight. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. These stories live nowhere else. The soldier led them outside. The air was colder than Käthe expected. Above the wire, the sky was the gray-blue of false dawn, that exact moment when the world has decided to be morning but has not yet committed. 2 trucks idled at the end of the path. A second soldier, older, with a thick mustache, waved them forward. Frau Drechsler, walking just ahead of Käthe, said softly in German, without turning her head, "Don't run. They will shoot you for running. Walk, like soldiers." Käthe walked. Her boots, German army boots, the ones she kept on for 4 years out of habit, made a soft slap against the gravel. She thought, this is the last sound I will make. Then she thought, no, my mother will hear this. That will be the last sound. Then she stopped thinking, because thinking was a luxury she could not afford anymore. The trucks did not go far. 5 minutes, perhaps 6. They stopped outside a long, low building with a tin roof. The young soldier opened the back of the truck and motioned for them to climb down. He held out a hand to help Elsbeth, and Elsbeth flinched away from it as though it were a snake. Inside the building there was steam. That was the first wrong thing. Steam and the smell of soap and the sound of running water. Käthe stopped just inside the doorway. She stared. Long rows of metal shower heads, wooden benches, folded clean clothes, gray cotton dresses, plain, undyed, but clean. 3 older women in white aprons stood at the far end of the room, holding towels. One of the towel women smiled at her. It was not a polite smile. It was not the smile of a person about to do something terrible. It was a tired, patient smile of someone who has been awake too long and is running behind on a chore. Käthe felt something inside her chest do a small, unfamiliar thing, like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there. Margit, behind her, whispered, "They are going to wash us," Frau Drechsler said. Yes, before. So they do not have to do it after. Käthe heard the older woman say it and felt nothing, because she had stopped being able to feel things several minutes ago. She undressed when she was told to undress. She placed her uniform, the gray skirt, the rough blouse, the small folded handkerchief in the pocket, on a wooden bench, and she made sure, even now, even in the last minutes, that the handkerchief was placed where she could find it again. Then she walked to the shower head. The water was warm. She had not stood under warm water in 11 months, not since a hotel bath in Vienna, in a city that did not exist anymore in the form she had known it. The water hit the back of her neck and ran down her shoulders, and she watched the dirt 3 weeks on the road run down her body in a brown stream toward the drain, and she understood with the dull clarity of someone watching a film about a stranger that she was being prepared for execution, and that the execution would at least be clean. One of the towel women, a thick-armed older woman with gray hair tucked under a kerchief, handed her a bar of soap. The soap was white. It smelled faintly of something herbal Käthe could not name. The woman did not smile this time. She just held out the soap with the patient impersonal kindness of a hospital orderly, and when Käthe took it, the woman said something in English, 3 words, and moved on to the next German woman behind her. Marsh, somewhere outside the room, did not translate. Käthe did not ask. She washed. Then they gave her clothes. Then they gave her a piece of bread. The bread was the moment everything broke. It was warm. It was soft. It was the kind of bread her grandmother had baked on Sundays in 1939, before the war was a war, when it had still only been a word adults used in lowered voices. Käthe held it in both hands and stared at it. And one of the towel women looked at her with concern and asked something in English that the young soldier translated awkwardly. She wants to know if you are ill. Käthe could not answer. She put the bread in her mouth and chewed, and she chewed, and she did not stop chewing even after she had swallowed, because if she stopped chewing, she was going to start crying, and Frau Drechsler had said no one was to cry. Soldiers do not cry on the way to the wall. The young soldier, his name, Käthe would learn later, was Corporal Marsh, 23 years old, born in Wisconsin of parents who had emigrated from Bremen, watched her chew. After a moment, he said something else in his careful German. Es gibt mehr. When Sie es wollen. There is more, if you want it. Käthe looked up at him. She looked at his face, at the narrow shoulders, the not-yet soldier's face, the small frown of someone trying to do a job he had not been trained for, and the entire architecture what Frau Drechsler had told her began, very quietly, to come apart. If you found this channel today, you weren't meant to leave yet. What Käthe is about to walk into is not the story she has been told. It is a story she will spend the next 40 years trying to understand. Hit subscribe. The next story is already up. It will stay with you longer than this one will. They were taken from the showers to a low wooden building with a sign over the door that read mess hall. Käthe was placed at the end of a long table. In front of her, on a metal tray, was a quantity of food she had not seen on a single plate in 3 years. 2 eggs, 3 thick slices of bread, butter, a pale yellow square that turned out to be cheese, a tin cup of something dark and steaming. She did not pick up the fork. She had decided, somewhere between the showers and the table, that she would not eat the food they put in front of her, because she had read once in a book, she could not remember which book, that the condemned were sometimes given a final meal. She would not be condemned in comfort. She would die hungry. It seemed important. Margaret, sitting across from her, said quietly, "Käthe, eat." Käthe shook her head. Margaret said, "Käthe, look at the soldiers." Käthe looked at the next table, for American soldiers were eating the same breakfast, the same eggs, the same bread, the same dark drink in the same tin cups. One of them was reading a letter. One of them was laughing at something the others had said. None of them were looking at the German women. None of them were watching, the way a person watches an animal they are about to kill. Käthe looked back at her plate. She picked up the fork. The eggs were the eggs of her childhood. The bread was the bread of her grandmother's kitchen. The cheese was... She could not place the cheese. She had never tasted that kind of cheese before, but it was good. The dark drink was coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute she had been drinking for 2 years. She drank it. Her hands shook. She put the cup down and picked it up again and drank again. Across the table, Elsbeth was eating with both hands, like a child, tears running down her face into food. Margaret was eating slowly, methodically, with a strange small smile that did not belong on the face of a woman about to die. Frau Drechsler, 3 seats down, was not eating. She sat very straight. She had cut her bread into 4 pieces and arranged them on her tray. She had not touched the eggs. She was watching the rest of them eat the way a teacher watches students fail an examination she had warned them about. Käthe finished her plate. Corporal Marsh appeared beside her with a metal pot. He said, in his careful German, "Coffee." "Yes?" Käthe held out her cup. He poured. The coffee was hot. She held the cup in both hands and felt the heat of it move into her fingers, and she understood, without being told, that no one was going to shoot her at dawn. Dawn was already here. Dawn had been here for an hour. She was sitting in it. She was drinking coffee in it. She began very quietly to cry. A man entered the mess hall, and the soldiers stood up. He was older, Käthe guessed mid-40s, with iron gray hair and the bearing of someone who had been an officer for a long time. He gestured for the soldiers to sit. He walked to the front of the room. Corporal Marsh moved to stand beside him to translate. The officer's name was Captain Whitley. He spoke for perhaps 2 minutes. He said that the women in this room were under his command and his protection. He said that they would be processed for medical examination, that they would be assigned beds in the women's barracks, and that they would, in time, be transferred to longer-term facilities or released. He said that no harm would come to them in this camp. He said it plainly, the way a man reads from a list. He did not promise. He did not soften. He simply said, "This is what will happen." Käthe listened to him through Marsh's translation, and she watched the captain's face of the lie. She had been trained, all her life, to look for the lie behind the official voice. The lie was usually in the eyes, in a small flicker, a quick glance away, the half-second before a difficult sentence. There was no flicker in Captain Whitley's eyes. He spoke to the women the way she had once heard her own father, a railway clerk in Stuttgart, read the next day's schedule to a room full of station masters, as something that was simply true, that had nothing to do with whether anyone in the room liked it. When he finished, he looked at the women. His eyes passed over the table and landed, briefly, on Frau Drechsler. He held her gaze for 2 seconds, and Käthe, watching, saw something move behind the captain's face that she could not name, something old and tired, and not surprised. Then he turned and left the room. A second officer came in shortly after, younger, brisker, holding a clipboard and a sheaf of papers. Lieutenant Hartwell. He did not introduce himself. He set up a small folding table near the door of the mess hall and called the women to it one by one. In the order their names appeared on his list. He had a stack of small number cards and a pin cushion. He worked quickly, the way a man works when he's been told to finish 47 women before lunch. Lindner, Käthe. She stood and walked to the table. He did not look up. He was writing the number on a card, 3074. He held out the card without raising his eyes. Käthe took it. He gestured for her to pin it to her dress herself. She fumbled with the pin. He watched the card, not her face. When the pin caught and held, he made a small mark on the list, said next, and reached for the next card. It took perhaps 20 seconds. Käthe walked back to her bench with the card pinned to her chest. The card had a number. The card did not have a name. She sat down and looked at the small white square of paper resting against the gray cotton of her dress, and she felt not gratitude, not relief, not anything she had been expecting to feel, a slow cold settling into her stomach. This was the part she had not heard about. This was the part Frau Drechsler had not warned her about, because Frau Drechsler had not known. The Americans were not going to kill them. The Americans were going to file them. They were going to be sorted, numbered, transferred, processed. And somewhere in that processing, Käthe understood they would stop being women and become entries on a sheet of paper. The food, the showers, the warm coffee, that was for the ledger. The ledger did not care about the coffee. The ledger only cared that the entry was complete. Margaret, beside her, saw her face. "Breathe," she said. "It's still better than dawn." Käthe breathed, but her hand had moved into her pocket without her noticing, and her fingers had closed around the small folded square of white linen she had carried with her since her mother had pressed it into her hand at the train station in 1942. The handkerchief had her grandmother's initials embroidered in one corner, L.M. Lottimüller, and a tiny edelweiss stitched in white thread beside them. She had carried it through 3 years of war. She had not used it once. She had not even unfolded it. It was her mother's handkerchief, and her mother's mother's, and as long as it stayed folded in her pocket, some part of her was still in Stuttgart. She held it now. She did not take it out. She just held it, and she felt the small worn edges of it under her thumb, and she made herself breathe. "I want to know something. At what point in this? The boots in the corridor, the warm shower, the bread, the lieutenant with the clipboard. Did your stomach turn? Drop the timestamp in the comments." I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now while you're still inside the story. Because what happens when Käthe goes back to the barracks and finds Frau Drechsler standing at the window, that is the moment I've been wanting to tell you about since this video began. They were marched back to the barracks at mid-morning. The other women, the ones who had been left behind, the ones who had not been on the dawn list, stared at them as they came in, and Käthe understood from the looks on their faces that they had also been told what dawn meant, and they had spent the last 4 hours believing they were the next. Frau Drechsler walked past them without speaking and went to window. She stood there for a long time. The morning light was full now, white and clean, the kind of light that does not let anyone hide. The other women began, slowly, to sit down. Margaret went to Elsbeth and put an arm around her. Someone laughed, quietly, in disbelief, and someone else hushed her, and Käthe stood in the middle of the barracks holding a handkerchief in her pocket and watching Frau Drechsler at the window. After a while, she walked over. She stopped beside the older woman. Frau Drechsler did not turn. She was looking at the dirt yard, at the wire, at the watchtower, at a tin cup someone had left on a bench and forgotten. Käthe said, in a voice she barely recognized, "You said you saw the lists." Frau Drechsler did not move. "Did you see the lists?" A long silence. Then, without turning, "No." Käthe waited. Frau Drechsler's jaw tightened. "I was told. By a man I trusted. In April, he had been told by a man he trusted. We believed it because it had happened in other places, in other camps, by other armies. I did not think to ask whether it was happening here. I told you the truth as I understood it. If the letter will reach him, I wanted you to know that I had written it." Käthe did not stop folding. "What did you write?" "That he was wrong. That I was wrong. That there were 47 women, and that we were all of us alive, and that he should know." Käthe folded the sheet in half and set it on the stack. "Why are you telling me?" Frau Drechsler thought about this for a long time. Then she said, "Because you're the one I told first. In the barracks. That night. You asked me, and I said the lists. You should know that I know. That is all." She turned and walked back to her bunk, and did not speak to Käthe again that day. The handkerchief stayed in her pocket. On the morning of the 14th day, a transfer order came. Margaret was being moved. So was Elsbeth, to a different camp, a different region, somewhere northwest. Käthe was not on the list. She would be staying. They had 4 hours to say goodbye. Käthe sat with Margaret on the bench outside the barracks. Margaret, who had not cried during dawn, was crying now, quietly. Käthe took the handkerchief out of her pocket, for the first time in 3 years, and unfolded it, and pressed it into Margaret's hand. No, Margaret said. No, this is your mother's. I know, Käthe said. Take it. Wherever you are going, my mother's hands have already been there. It will be all right. Margaret pressed it to her face. The tiny edelweiss was just visible against her wet skin. When the truck came, she gave it back, kissed Käthe on the cheek, and climbed in without looking back. The truck pulled away. Käthe stood in the dirt yard with a handkerchief in her hand and watched the dust until there was no more truck to see. She walked back into the barracks. It was empty. Half the beds were stripped. Elsbeth's had a folded note on it, a child's drawing of a sun, with the words Danke, Käthe underneath. Käthe sat on the edge of her own bed and held the handkerchief, and understood that she was alone now, in a different way than she had been alone before. The dawn had not killed her. The transfer order had not separated her from anyone she loved. But the people who had walked into the dawn beside her were gone, and the room was quiet, and there was no one left who had been in the corridor at 3 a.m. except Frau Drechsler, who would not look at her, and Käthe herself. If that hit you, the empty barracks, the drawing on the bed, the handkerchief in her hand, then you understand why this channel exists. These women were not statistics. They were not villains. They were people who had been lied to, and people who had to live with what happened after the lie. Subscribe. There are more of them. They deserve to be remembered. 3 weeks later, Captain Whitley came to the barracks. He did not come for Käthe specifically. He came with Corporal Marsh, looking for women who had nursing experience or who could speak passable English. He needed help in the medical building. Margaret had been the obvious candidate, but Margaret was gone. Käthe, who had operated a radio, not a hospital ward, who knew almost no English at all, raised her hand anyway, because the alternative was sitting in the half-empty barracks for another month, and she could no longer sit. She was assigned to the medical building. She was given a clean apron. She was told to follow the orders of the American medic, a thin, tired man whose name she never quite caught, and to ask Corporal Marsh to translate when something confused her. On her 4th morning in the medical building, a small girl was brought in. She was 9 years old. Her name was Eleanor. She was Captain Whitley's daughter. Käthe had not known the captain had a daughter, and she had tripped on the gravel path outside her father's quarters and cut her chin on a stone. The cut was not deep, but it was bleeding heavily, and she was crying the way children cry when they have been brave for as long as they can manage and have suddenly run out. The medic was busy. Käthe was nearest. She sat down on the bench beside the girl and reached for a clean cloth, and stopped because all the cloths were gone, used up that morning on a soldier who had cut his hand on a fence wire. Käthe took the handkerchief out of her pocket. She unfolded it slowly. She had carried it folded for so many years that the creases had become part of the cloth, sharp, permanent, white inside the folds where the sun had not been able to reach. The initials, the Edelweiss, the small worn corner where her thumb had rested through 3 years of war. She held it for 1 second more, long enough to see her mother's face on the platform at the Stuttgart station in 1942, long enough to feel her grandmother's kitchen in 1939, long enough to remember the kite tree and the green twine, and then she pressed the handkerchief gently against the girl's chin. Eleanor stopped crying. The blood went into the white linen slowly. Käthe watched it spread, first along one fiber, then another, then in a slow dark bloom around the Edelweiss, the white thread of the embroidery turning black where the blood reached it. The flower was disappearing. Her grandmother's hands had made the flower in 1908, in a small house in Bavaria, sitting near a window. The flower was now becoming part of an American child's wound. Käthe held the cloth steady. Her own hand, she noticed, was not shaking. She held the cloth in place and said, in her broken English, the only sentence she had practiced for 3 weeks, "It will be all right." The girl looked at her, looked at the handkerchief, looked at the small white Edelweiss, soaking dark with her own blood. "That's pretty," she said, in the voice of a child who has been taught to be polite even while bleeding. "What is it?" "It is a flower," Käthe said, "from the mountains. My grandmother. She made it." Eleanor said, very seriously, "I'll give it back to you when I'm fixed." Käthe almost said yes. She almost took it. Then she said in German, because the English would not come, and Marsh behind her translated softly, "No, keep it. I want you to keep it." "Why?" Käthe looked at the small girl's face, at the round child's eyes, at the chin she was holding closed with her grandmother's handkerchief, and she said, simply, because someone gave it to me when I needed it, and now you need it. That is how it works. Käthe stared at her. Frau Dressler turned at last. Her face was old. Her eyes were dry. She said, that is the worst part. I told you the truth as I understood it, and I was wrong. And you almost died of fear, because I was wrong. Käthe did not know what to say to her. She found, surprise in herself, that she could not be angry. Not the way she wanted to be. Not the way she'd been planning to be in the 4 minutes between leaving the mess hall and walking to the barracks door. The older woman's face was the face of someone who had just lost something larger than her own life. Käthe looked at her and understood, dimly, that there were going to be many people in the coming years who had told the truth as they understood it, and had been wrong, and would have to live with it. She walked away from the window. The days passed. They passed strangely. Käthe was assigned to a bed near Margit's. They were given work. Folding laundry, peeling potatoes in a kitchen run by an older American sergeant who had no particular feelings about Germans one way or the other and treated them like new employees at a factory. The sergeant's name was Hollis. He chewed unlit cigars and addressed the women collectively as ladies in a tone that suggested he had used the same word for 30 years on 30 different work crews and had never adjusted it for context. Corporal Marsh appeared every few days with paperwork. Once he came with a letter from his sister in Wisconsin, who had asked him to translate it for himself first, and then for the German women, if any of them wanted to hear American news. The letter was about a dog who had eaten a sock, an entire wool sock, his sister's husband's sock, and survived, and how the family had spent 2 days arguing about whether to call a veterinarian or simply wait. Käthe and Margit laughed for the first time in 11 months. Käthe, hearing herself laugh, was so surprised by the sound that she stopped and stared at the table, and Marsh, embarrassed, looked away. After that, he came once a week with another letter. He brought them. Käthe understood eventually, on purpose. He brought them because he had noticed what laughing did to her face. He also began, very quietly, to teach her English. He did not call it teaching. He simply began saying things in English first, and then in German, and waiting to see if she would repeat the English back. The eggs are good. The water is warm. It is a flower. She repeated them. Sometimes she got them wrong. He never corrected her in front of the others. Frau Dressler did not speak to Käthe again for 9 days. On the 10th day, she walked over while Käthe was folding laundry alone at the long bench. She did not sit down. She stood beside Käthe with her hands clasped in front of her and watched her fold a single sheet for nearly a minute before she said, very quietly, I have written to the man who told me. I do not know Eleanor, nodded gravely. When her father came to take her back to his quarters, Käthe watched them walk down the gravel path. Eleanor holding the bloodied handkerchief in one hand, her father's hand in the other, and she stood in the doorway of the medical building and understood, finally, what had happened to her at dawn 3 weeks earlier. She had not been spared by the Americans. She had been seen by them, not as an enemy, not as a number, as a woman who had been told a terrible thing and had walked out into the morning believing it. They had given her food and clothes and a number on a card, and she had thought that meant they did not see her, but they had seen her. Captain Whitley had seen her in the mess hall. Corporal Marsh had seen her chewing the bread. The towel women in the showers had seen her. They had seen her, and they had let her live. And now a small girl was walking away with her grandmother's handkerchief because seeing was something that could be passed forward. She went back inside the medical building. She picked up a clean apron. She got to work. If that moment hit you, the handkerchief, the small girl, what Käthe finally understood, then you already know what this channel is for. These were not villains, and they were not statistics. They were people learning, slowly and painfully, that the war they had been told about was not the war they had lived through. Subscribe. There are more of them. Every story I have left to tell. Käthe Lindner lived to be 78 years old. She was released from the camp in late 1946, returned to a Stuttgart that was no longer the Stuttgart she had left, found her parents alive in the apartment of a cousin, found the sycamore tree gone. The whole street was gone, replaced by a row of new buildings that looked nothing like the old ones. She trained as a nurse. She married a man named Klaus who had been a prisoner in France and who had come back from his own camp with a similar quietness about him. The kind of quietness that two people recognize in each other without having to explain it. They had 2 daughters. She did not talk about the war very often. Not because it was painful, but because she had decided, somewhere in the medical building of an American camp, that the war was not the most interesting thing about her life. The most interesting thing was what came after. She wrote to Margaret twice in 1947 and never received a reply. She tried to find Elsbeth in 1962 through a tracing service and was told the records had been lost. She never heard the name Eleanor Whitley again. She never tried to find Corporal Marsh, because she understood, eventually, that finding would have meant turning him from a memory into a man, and she preferred the memory. In 1996, near Lake Constance, her granddaughter, a girl of 9, almost the age Eleanor had been, asked her grandmother what the worst day of the war had been. Käthe was in the kitchen. She was making coffee. Real coffee. The kind that came in a tin from the supermarket and that her granddaughter took for granted in a way that Käthe never quite managed to take for granted herself. There was an Edelweiss in the window box, a real one, that Klaus had planted for her 30 years earlier, and that came back every spring, white and small and stubborn, a little colony of them now, climbing the windowsill, soft against the morning light. She thought for a long time. Then she said, "The bombings of Stuttgart. When I was 16, that was the worst day." The granddaughter said, "And the camp? In America?" And Käthe smiled, a small private smile that the granddaughter would remember for the rest of her own life, and said, "The camp was where the corporal told me the eggs were good." And he was right. She poured the coffee. Outside the window, the Edelweiss was very white in the morning light. One last thing before you go. What do you think Käthe felt? Not in the corridor, not in the mess hall, not in the medical building, but in that kitchen, 50 years later, with the coffee and the Edelweiss and her granddaughter asking her about the war? Tell me below. 1 sentence. I read every single one. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment. The next story is already waiting. It begins with a German nurse who arrived in an American medical tent expecting torture, and what she found instead changed her life. The link is on your screen. Subscribe and click it now. The next hour starts where this one just ended.